But now, I think Courtney must be back.
Sorry, I'm an idiot.
That's okay.
I always plug my laptop in and forget to turn the power on. Duh.
That's okay. Andrew's joined us in the interim. So, yeah, now we've just recapped about the three kinds, but now Socrates wants to look at the fourth kind. Let this be our joint investigation. See now whether you think it necessary that everything comes to be through some cause. And of course, Protarchus agrees to that, certainly. So this is really interesting, I think. And is it not the case that there is no difference between the nature of what makes and the cause except in name, so that the maker and the cause would rightly be called one? Now, this is so interesting from a later Stoic point of view, because as we know, the Stoics argued that everything is both a cause and an effect, depending on where it sits in the matrix or the network of um, agents, really. Everything is an agent of both cause and effect. So I think quite possibly, this is the very genesis of that doctrine.
And maybe that whole idea of fate as cause, and fate is synonymous with God as well.
Yeah, possibly. Well, I think that was probably earlier in kind of culture and literature, but this specifically, I think this idea around the cause and the effect being one in some fundamental sense, I think is quite possibly here. And so Socrates kind of pushes this. But what about what is made and what comes into being? Will we not find the same situation that they also do not differ except in name? And Protarchus is convinced. And so, yeah, Socrates is thinking about procedure of cause and effect here. So, whatever the craftsman, he calls it the craftsman, who produces all these must be the fourth kind, the cause, since it has been demonstrated sufficiently that it differs from the others. So all the others are kind of effects, but there must be something which brings those into existence. Okay, now we have another of these useful recap sections where, because we've got a little bit confused about where we're all at. So Socrates and Protarchus go back. Let us continue then. We declared the life that combines pleasure and knowledge the winner, didn't we? We did. Should we not take a look at this life and see what it is and to which kind it belongs? So we will, I think, assign it to the third kind, for it is not a mixture of just two elements, but of the sort where all that is unlimited is tied down by limit. It would seem right then to make our victorious form of life part of that kind. But how, and then so Socrates goes back to the first thing, which was Philebus's form of preferred kind of life, which is pleasant and unlimited and unmixed. To which of the established kinds?
What is this happening?
Hi, Kyle. Long time no see.
Kyle, we can hear you groaning.
Hi, Kyle.
You've come in right at a difficult moment in the mid dialogue, so welcome. What about your kind of life, Philebus, which is pleasant and unmixed? To which of the established kinds should it by right be assigned? But before you make your pronouncement, answer me the following question. Just tell me, says Philebus. Again, another moment of slight frustration. Do pleasure and pain have a limit, or are they of the sort that admit the more and the less? Certainly the sort that admit the more, Socrates. For how could pleasure be all that is good if it were not by nature boundless in plenty and increase? So Philebus is quite sharp, I think. Now we find him, he's put upon his mettle here. He's having to defend his position, and he's quite able to do that.
And Socrates says something important here, right? Oh, there's two of me. Do you want to read out what Socrates says? I've got feedback.
Yeah, okay. So nor would, on the other hand, pain be all that is bad, Philebus. So we have to search for something besides its unlimited character that would bestow on pleasures a share of the good. But take note that pleasure is thereby assigned to the boundless. As to assigning intelligence, knowledge, and reason to one of our aforesaid kinds, How can we avoid the danger of blasphemy, Protarchus and Philebus? A lot seems to hinge on whether or not we give the right answer to this question. So this is another appeal to the divine, right? And Philebus has no patience for this. Really now, you're extolling your own god, Socrates. Socrates says, just as you extol that goddess of yours, Philebus. That's Aphrodite. But the question needs an answer nevertheless. Protarchus, God bless him, Socrates is right in this, Philebus. We must obey him.
And remember, before it was Protarchus that was quite happy for Socrates to talk about dreams and what the gods told him and stuff. But Philebus is one of these people with a certain bad kind of character, I think, that he was referring to later on.
Yeah, that's right. And so he says, didn't you choose to speak instead of me? So he's quite happy for Protarchus to do the hard yards, and he's just going to, chime in at when it suits him. But Protarchus, again, he's honest. I'm now at a loss, and I entreat you, Socrates, to act as our spokesman so that we do not misstate the case of your candidate and thus introduce a false note into the discussion. So, good on Protarchus because he's confused. He doesn't want to give Philebus the wrong idea of where they've got to, and he's not going to say anything that he knows is wrong. He's quite. I really like Protarchus because of this honest consciousness of his own, dare I say, limitations.
And he's a kind of exemplar of the kind of interlocutor you need for Socratic discourse to work. If Philebus and Socrates were talking alone, it probably wouldn't work.
Correct. Exactly. Okay, so Socrates kind of backtracks a bit. But did my playful exaltation really confuse you, as Philebus claims, when I asked to what kind reason and knowledge belonged? Tarkus, it certainly did, Socrates. He's quite confused. Okay, so a bit of a recap again. It is easy to settle, nevertheless, Socrates says, for all the wise are agreed in true self-exaltation that reason is our king, both over heaven and earth, and perhaps they are justified. But let us go into the discussion of this class itself at greater length if you have no objections. Discuss it in whatever way you like, Socrates. Don't be apologetic about long-windedness. We will not lose patience. Now, this is where Socrates brings in, again, this is a share of the divine. It's about the cosmos and how the cosmos is governed by reason. And again, this is, of course, key to Stoic ideas. Whether we hold the view that the universe and this whole world order is ruled by unreason and irregularity, as chance would have it, or whether they are not rather, as our forebears taught us, governed by reason and by the order of a wonderful intelligence. Now, Protarchus, again, God love him, he's a bit shocked. How can you even think of a comparison here, Socrates? What you suggest now is downright impious, I would say. The only account that can do justice to the wonderful spectacle presented by the cosmic order of sun, moon, and stars, and the revolution of the whole heaven, is that reason arranges it all, and I, for my part, would never waver in saying or believing it. Okay, so we're all agreed on that. And Socrates now goes back to the elements. We somehow discern that what makes up the nature of the bodies of all animals, fire, water, and air, and earth, as storm-battered sailors say, are part of their composition. Bit of a joke here, Protarchus. Very much so. We're indeed battered by difficulties in our discussion. Okay, so Socrates goes on to say that we all have these elements, but they're in small quantities. But there is something called fire. And again, this must be a key text for Stoicism. There is something called fire that belongs to us. And then again, there is fire in the universe. So for the Stoics, this was pure technikon, creative fire. And is it not the fire that belongs to us in small in amount, feeble and poor, while the fire in the universe overwhelms us by its size and beauty and by the display of all its power? Okay, so there's this cosmic fire of which we all have a portion, which is a very familiar idea from the Stoics. And earth as well. And if we talk about these elements as a unit, we give it the name body. Again, key doctrine.
And importantly, this is that, like you say, key doctrine, but very important in the history of medieval magic and all that nonsense, is this idea of that macrocosm, microcosm linkage. And it's lovely to see it, how far back it goes. It's so ancient. That
Yeah, isn't it great? I
the
think this is
material composition of the human being is sort of the same as the whole cosmos.
yeah, 100%. It's I haven't usually seen the Philebus quoted as a key Stoic source, but now I'm thinking it probably was.
Oh, there's some stuff in later on too that I just think, oh my God, like that could seriously be unpacked. You know, there's some really, really cool stuff in this text, I reckon.
100%. Okay, so we've got the body that's the universe, and of the body that belongs to us, Socrates says, will we not say that it has a soul? Quite obviously, Protarchus is all in here. But where does it come from? Unless the body of the universe, which has the same properties as ours, but more beautiful in all respects, happens to possess a soul. So again, this is kind of inferring from the microcosm to the macrocosm, rather than the other way around.
And we see it in the Timaeus as well, don't we?
Yep. Okay, so this cause is recognized as all-encompassing wisdom, since among us it imports the soul and provides training for the body and medicine for its ailments, and in other cases, order and restitution, but that it should fail to be responsible for the same things on a large scale in the whole universe, things that are, in addition, beautiful and pure, for the contrivance of what has so fair and wonderful a nature. That would make no sense at all. Interestingly, one of the things that people talk about today all the time is scaling. This is an argument from scaling. This is an argument that that if we can observe order and a right balance of elements all around us, that why wouldn't we imagine it's been scaled up? This is what this argument is. Okay, so there's plenty of the unlimited in the universe as well as sufficient limit, and that there is above them a certain cause of no small significance that orders and coordinates the years, seasons, and months, these cosmic cycles, and which has every right to the title of wisdom and reason. So there could be no wisdom and reason without a soul. And so in the nature of Zeus, there is a soul of a king, as well as a king's reason, and in virtue of this power displayed by the cause, while paying tribute for other fine qualities in the other divinities, in conformity with the names by which they like to be addressed. Remember at the start, Socrates was quite hesitant about how we should talk about Aphrodite because he's quite cautious about these names. And here he mentions this matter again.
And they all belong together. There's a kind of respect between the various powers or whatever, and and I think that's where there's going to be a window, right, where pleasure is not all bad because it you know understood well. It's a feature of the goddess Aphrodite, but maybe it's not exactly the kind of pleasure that Philebus is talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so at the end of page 418, Socrates is quite satisfied that reason belongs to that kind, which is the cause of everything. So reason is causative. That's where we've got to. But that was one of our four kinds.
Oh, hang on, before you go over
Oh,
the page. On the bottom of the page, doesn't he say, do not think that we have engaged in an idle discussion here, Protarchus, for it comes as a support for the thinkers of old who held the view that reason is forever the ruler of the universe. It certainly does. It also has provided an answer to my query that reason belongs to that kind which is the cause of everything, but that was one. Of our four kinds. Anyway, sorry, the bit that I was curious about was, Protarchus got a bit shirty, a little bit funny about Socrates sort of questioning the authority of the ancient wisdom. And here he says, look, you know, my reasoning supports what the um, authorities have said about this matter, so it's not a problem, right? And he's like, yeah, it certainly does. But I think the point here too is that Socrates is not beyond questioning established wisdom. He's showing that if it's correct, you can reason and come to the same conclusions as those before you did. That's what he's doing. But he's showing you that he's not blindly following along. I think that's what's going on there.
Yeah, I think you're right. Okay, so they've arrived at a satisfactory explanation of the class that reason belongs to and what power it has. So reason is kind of causative. Let us firmly keep in mind about both of them that reason is akin to cause and is part of that family, while pleasure itself is unlimited and belongs to the kind that in and by itself neither possesses nor will ever possess a beginning, middle, or end. So that's Socrates is explaining that if we decide that something is unlimited, then that by definition means it doesn't have a beginning or an end. It's kind of formless, which is even hard to kind of imagine or understand. And so then he wants to start a discussion about generation. How do things come to be? Let us take pleasure first. And Socrates says that pleasure and pain seem to me by nature to arise together in the common kind. And again, Protarchus is a bit confused. Could you remind us once again, Socrates, which of those you mentioned is called the common kind? And so what Socrates means is that there was number 3, which is the mixed form of pleasure and reason. And this is really interesting because we've covered this in a number of readings before. As you would remember, Courtney, I think it was in that article about disintegration by Julia Annis. So Socrates says that what I claim is that when we find a harmony in living creatures disrupted, there will at the same time be a disintegration of their nature and a rise of pain. So this is the idea of disintegration as a cause of discomfort and negative experience. And it's a very powerful idea. And I think we're probably seeing a key text for it here.
I think it's also, maybe I'm reading it slightly different, but I think it's also an account of hunger and thirst and things like that. So it's a talking, in a sense, about what we might call homeostasis as well, this idea of harmony, which is the mixed, isn't it? It's one, yeah. And so it's sort of an account of why the mixed is sort of um, superior, I guess. Um, it's it's why the limited and the unlimited alone need something more. They need this kind of harmonizing influence, which kind of binds them together. And I think you just read it a couple of pages ago. It's the thing that brings health and homeostasis, basically, like balance to the picture.
Yeah, it's kind of reverting to what's what we would call the kind of the normal window of life. So Protarchus kind of tries to get Socrates to be a bit more explicit about it. He explains about hunger and thirst being a source of discomfort and a desire for the opposite, which is a refilling with liquid or food. And
You
it's
know,
kind of interesting psychologically, this section, I think. He's kind of outlining what's going on with these basic drives in a kind of an interesting form of analysis.
it's really interesting to find it here because I've read this argument somewhere else. I've read it in Margaret Graver's book, but she ascribes it to someone else, like Calcidius or Celsus or someone much later down in history. She didn't seem to be aware that it appears here in Philebus because she says the same thing. She's saying that some later authors, whether it was Chalcidius, I can't remember, used exactly this way of thinking. And you know how Diogenes Laertius has that comment that line that says the idea of the organisms, what do you call it, eikiosis is to select its own constitution first. This is where this argument comes in to fit that slot, because the idea is that there's a seed of love within the organism. It's this self-loving thing which selects its own constitution, and when it experiences thirst, it experiences pain, which is the accidental or kind of, what do you call it? I guess accidental consequence of needing to meet its constitutional requirements, which is to drink, basically, to meet its needs. And the same with hunger. So the point they're making, that apparently the Stoics picked up on, is exactly how human beings accidentally confuse pain and pleasure as the good, when in fact, according to that way of thinking, it's the requirement to love, that oikiosis thing, to meet the constitutional requirements of the organism, because it treats itself as choice worthy. That's what's primary. But because you experience pleasure and pain in relation to that, there's the possibility, the likely possibility, that we come to think of those things as primary, and the eating and drinking to maintain homeostasis as secondary. So it's really interesting to find it here. Sorry about my long-winded thing, but it's to me, it's always been a really fascinating argument, because it sounds so like modern and biological, really.
Yeah, I agree. That's really well put, Courtney. Thank you for that. And I think, to a certain extent, I think Plato and Socrates here are kind of, moving around these matters without necessarily being particularly precise about it. And so I think, but the observations, I would say, about what's actually going on are fascinating and yeah, influential later on.
And
So
this
yeah,
just
so
just
so this
quickly,
idea about there being a sort of a uh, as you say, homeostasis, Courtney. I'm trying to think of another way of putting it, but a kind of a mode in which a normal range, I suppose, is the right, one way of thinking about it,
yeah.
which again implies a measure, right? Which implies a ratio, which implies a limit.
And it also implies that, the thing the Stoics are interested in, this self-selection, how the organism is able then to respond to that and somehow do what's required of it in order to uh, cause that harmony to happen, through motion and movement and the like, which I think is really important in the Stoic account, movement. And Spinoza, of course, just to finish that thought off, he calls it conatus, doesn't he? So he picks up on exactly the same theme.
Okay, so there's a extended discussion about what the relationship is between pleasure and pain. And there's this idea of, well, is there a person who experiences neither without pleasure or pain? Is that, and Socrates says here, he may then live in this fashion, and perhaps there would be nothing absurd if this life turns out to be the most godlike. Now, again, I think that's probably had some influence on Stoicism, this idea that someone who is not influenced by pleasure, pain, desires, one way or another, maybe is living the most godlike life. And as Protarchus says, it's at any rate not likely that the gods experience either pleasure or the opposite. Well, that's kind of our kind of everyman Protarchus has been led to a fairly heterodox position here, because certainly in classical Greek myth, certainly the gods understood pleasure and the opposite. So he's been led to quite a heretical position here.
I think this is how Epicurus hijacks this argument,
Yes.
though,
Yeah,
because he
I
says
agree.
that the gods don't experience pleasure and
Mm.
pain because they're self-sufficient. And so Epicurus's form of pleasure is really just the absence of pain. He's actually kind of using this argument to say this is precisely what a person should have, an absence of pleasure and pain, for which Epicurus would call that pleasure. And that's why I remember that he always gets into trouble for misusing the idea of pleasure, because it's not what we think of when we talk about pleasure.
Yeah, exactly. And this I found really interesting from a kind of a physiological and psychological point of view. This point where Socrates down the bottom of the page says, you must realize that some of the various affections of the body are extinguished within the body before they reach the soul, leaving it unaffected. Others penetrate through both body and soul and provoke a kind of upheaval that is peculiar to each, but also common to both of them. So what he's kind of getting at here is that most of the functions of the body, for example, our digestion, our breathing, these things all take place without our being conscious of them. But there are some things that penetrate to our souls, that's to say our conscious awareness and our responses. So yeah, that's a really sort of sophisticated observation, I think, that so many of the things that our body is occupied in doing, we don't even notice. But that there are some experiences which affect both. I thought that was an amazingly penetrating observation. So, and it explains here as well. So this kind of non-perception is not forgetting because it's not something we're ever conscious of. But so he says the disturbance of the body are subject to non-perception. So we don't usually, we wouldn't necessarily notice if, for example, what don't we often notice? Whether we're getting hotter or colder, for example. It's only when we reach a certain point that it suddenly penetrates to our kind of conscious experience.
And
So
here's
yeah, this is such an interesting passage for kind of the history of perception.
And here's this idea of perception and motion and how they come together. Because I always think the Stoics are always talking about motion in the background. And again, you see it here too. He says, when the soul and body are jointly affected and moved by one and the same affection, if you call this motion perception, you would say nothing out of the way. And that's, to expand on that, the Stoic thinking about disturbance and passion, they're all upheavals and movements and kinetic elements in the soul that are out of balance and out of harmony. So fear is a quick shrinking down, for example, and delight is a surging outwards and forwards and so on. I think it's really important to notice that physical movement element that is in Stoicism, because it concerns bodies, but I think it does something else too, and I think it comes into play later on when they start to work out certain techniques. But I won't spoil that for you. We'll wait till we get there.
Yeah, so I think this is such an interesting passage. And again, I think Protarchus is kind of just following along here. So Socrates says, so if someone were to call memory the preservation of perception, he would be speaking correctly as far as I'm concerned. And that's interesting as well, right? This categorization of memory as the preservation of perception. And do we not hold that recollection differs from memory? Protarchus isn't very sure, perhaps. Does not their difference lie in this? Do we not call it recollection when the soul recalls as much as possible by itself, without the aid of the body, what she had once experienced together with the body? Or how would you put it? So what do we think he's talking about there? I guess he's talking, well, maybe he's talking about, for example, if you remember what it felt like to be frightened, or what it felt like to be in love with a certain person you're not in love with anymore, or things like that.
Yeah, I was going to say emotion, like emotional memory, maybe,
Yeah. So at one sense, at one stage in your life, that would have been something you experienced in the body as well. Now you don't, but you can kind of remember what it was like. Which again is fascinating. This idea, these ideas around recollection and memory.
Yeah, he doesn't go into it much here, but if you recall in the Phaedo, right, his whole idea of recollection was that there was a time when you existed before you had a body, and that in that account, learning, gaining knowledge of things has something to do with recollecting what the soul had already experienced prior to life. And if you remember the Meno, he tries to prove it, remember, with that, getting the little slave boy to work out that mathematical equation that he'd never learnt before, but he could because he was able to recognize, recollect, the forms that partake in that particular kind of thing.
Yeah, that's possible. That's totally possible way of reading that. That's a little couple of sentences there.
Yeah, and I will say that some very prominent philosophers very recently have, well, one in particular, argued that in favor of this kind of or sort of a Platonic reincarnation idea. So anyway, that's really interesting. It's not as if these things are entirely out of the question these days. These things are still very much in play, I would argue. Okay, so what Socrates is trying to get at here is that we grasp as fully and clearly as possible the pleasure that the soul experiences without the body, as well as the desire. And through a clarification of these states, the nature of both pleasure and desire will somehow be revealed. Okay, so what is the origin of pleasure? Let us determine that then, says Protarchus boldly. We have nothing to lose. But Socrates can't even help making a joke here. By discovering what we're looking for, we'll lose our ignorance about it. Boom, boom. Okay, so we're back to desires, hunger and thirst, and many other things of this sort. What's the common feature of them? So it's when we're thirsty, we are desiring a drink, and whoever among us is emptied, it seems, desires the opposite of what he suffers. Being empty, he desires to be filled. All right, but what if he hasn't had any experience of it?
I think this is the problem with his recollection theory, because it makes it clunky and difficult to follow his reasoning here. But what he's sort of saying, I think, is, if someone is emptied for the first time, is there any way he could be in touch with feeling, either through sensation or memory, since he has no experience of it either in the present or ever in the past? And if I recall where he goes with this, he's sort of implying that the soul knows what it's like beforehand, before having a body, what it's like to require filling. There's no first time in having a body. It belongs to the soul, not to the body.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That's what I don't like about it, because it suddenly gets like overly difficult.
Well, anyway, but as he says, the only option we're left with is that the soul makes contact with the feeling and clearly must do so through memory. And Protarchus hasn't anything else to offer there. So, in that case, our argument forces us to conclude that desire is not a matter of the body. But Protarchus is clearly not quite grasping. He says, why is that? Because it shows that every living creature always strives towards the opposite of its own experience. Now, that seems a bit of a stretch, I would say. The impulse then that drives it towards the opposite of its own state signifies that it has memory of that opposite state.
Yeah, see, this is where you can feel it, right? It feels harder to follow. It feels clunky because he's working on this idea of the soul in the background as having lived before the body.
Okay, so for our discussion seems to me to indicate there is a form of life that consists of these conditions. It consists of filling and emptying, and all such processes as are related to the preservation and the destruction of animals. And when one of us is in either of the two conditions, he is in pain, or again, he experiences pleasure, depending on the nature of these changes. But what about this kind of in-between phase? And this is kind of hard for Protarchus to understand.
See, a consequence of what he's done here too is he has a very strong distinction between body and soul. That's one of the things that makes it you can see why the Epicureans and the Stoics take this idea and try and simplify it or try and change it, because they don't have the same sort of division that Socrates is trying to work out here.
Yeah, I think you're right, Courtney, because as you say, it brings in all these complications, which, the Stoics and the Epicureans tried to simplify by um, severing the non-corporeal side of the equation. So, but Socrates also brings in here this kind of temporal aspect. So when somebody is in a particular state, then they've got the hope of being in the opposite state, particularly that if they're in a state of deficiency, they have the hope of being in the state of fulfillment.
And this is where desire enters the picture, right? And desire is not of the body, but of the soul.
Yeah.
So we can now have a theory of emotion as disturbances within the soul.
Yep. And we also have this idea brought in about true and false pleasures and pains. So this is, again something the Stoics are going to pick up on, because they will assert that we have negative emotions because we have false beliefs about future events, essentially, present or future events. And it's propositional. And this is what, again, Socrates is kind of sketching out here.
Yeah, he does the propositional bit well too, doesn't he? Because he says there's like a craftsman and he follows you around and he paints a picture, and the other one,
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
yeah, so
That must be
he's doing that bit.
a bit further on, I think. Sorry, I probably should move a bit more quickly. Okay, so this is about judgments. It's about whether our judgments are correct or not. And Socrates says here, but if some state should attach itself to any of them, we would say the judgment becomes a bad one and the pleasure becomes bad too. So this is again linking states of pleasure with false or true judgments, which again the Stoics are going to run with.
And Socrates kind of pulls them apart, and he's sort of trying to say there are bad pleasures and there are good pleasures, and there are bad judgments and there are good judgments. There's a relationship somehow, and judgment is higher in the pecking order than pleasure, but you can have bad and good pleasures outside of what judgment's doing, it seems like.
Yeah. And I found this again a really interesting passage from a kind of a proto-Stoic point of view. So Socrates kind of elucidates what he means about judgments, and he kind of outlines what, again, the Stoics, such as Epictetus, would insist upon: interrogating impressions. So he says, wouldn't you say that it often happens that someone who cannot get a clear view because he is looking from a distance wants to make up his mind about what he sees? Might he then not raise another question for himself? What could it be that appears to stand near that rock under a tree? Do you find it plausible that someone might say these words to himself when he sets his eyes on such appearances? So this is exactly, again, what the Stoics would call the interrogation of impressions. This is an attempt to establish what has caused a particular impression. And might he not afterwards, as an answer to his own question, say to himself, it is a man, and so in so speaking would get it right? But might he also be mistaken and say that what he sees is a statue, the work of some herdsman? But if he were in company, he might actually say out loud to his companion what he had told himself. And so what we earlier called judgment would turn into an assertion. So all these ideas around judgments, assertions, sayables, interrogations, this is what the Stoics are going to work upon.
And by the way, this is really interesting, this aspect of it. And I like how you can see again, there's a really interesting difference the way the Stoics deal with this problem of perception. And I think it goes like this. So Plato here is talking about, like, the guy, and he sees a person under the tree, but maybe it's not a person, maybe it's a statue, whatever. So later on, when he talks about pleasure in a completely unrelated way, but I think it's the same or similar, because he uses a similar argument in Protagoras as well. He says the problem with pleasure is that you can see it up close, like it's right in your face, but it needs an appropriate measure or ratio somehow that comes in and puts it in perspective so that you can see pleasure at the right distance away from where it, so from it really where it stands in terms of perception. But just has this quality where, because it's of its intensity or whatever, it appears to be bigger than pain because it's right on top of you. Now, this idea of ratio and measure and stuff buys into the idea of the forms, right? Because it has a kind of mathematical quality to it as well. The Stoics deal with it differently, you see that, and this is why I think motion's really interesting. So bear with me. What do you think if I was a Stoic? Rather than use that method that he's talking about of a mathematical or harmonic kind of balance, the Stoics are looking for, what would you call it? Something like, because there are no forms, remember, they can't rely on the forms in the same way as Socrates can to look for a measure. They're looking at specific, concrete, the many. And what the Stoics come up with, in my opinion, is something like a, um, a checkerboard of relational pinpoints scattered about that are all interconnected and somehow relate to the object of perception that is that somehow connects them all together in that moment. So the man under the tree, that may or may not be a man, because the Stoics are thinking relationally instead of mathematically. I think what they would try to do as a technique for exploring the impression, rather than looking for a ratio or a kind of mathematical harmony, they will try to envisage the the missing parts of the percept from other relational points of view. So they'll see it from another person's point of view, or they'll see it from um, the view from above, which again is a way of moving your perceptual point in space to a completely foreign one, which is designed to fill in more of the missing perceptual features that you couldn't make out given your particular position in space and time. And you could apply it to other people's perceptions, the people in the community's perceptions, the perception from time, the perception from space, and the perception from the whole. So the Stoic method is really interesting because they throw out the forms. They can't rely on this mathematical philosophy of harmony. They have to rely on a relational philosophy of interconnectedness and sharing in the perspective of other people who, like you, have an equal share in reason and therefore can contribute equally, so that each person can give, say, a partial account of the perception, but put together, the partial accounts will start to look like an adequate impression or a cataleptic impression. That's what I think's going on.
Great stuff. Thanks, Courtney. That was great. I like the idea of that whole network or matrix of everything, like a big web of connectedness and nodes everywhere.
Well, and understood that way, right? Suddenly you can understand why they would have the view from above. It's not like some sort of hippie exercise. It's the man under the tree cannot be approached from the point of view that I'm fixed in time and space at right now. So I have to take a completely different relational point in relation to that thing. So I choose to see it from above, or from close to my death, for example, as Marcus Aurelius would, like, and you see then the thing under the tree, using Socrates' point of view, it reveals what is hidden in it. But it doesn't reveal everything hidden in it. It's basically, Catherine would get this from a phenomenological point of view, right? This is Heidegger in a sense, isn't it? It's like, from one point of view, one perspective, you only see one aspect of the thing. And if you could get around behind it and see it from the opposite side, you'd see another hidden aspect of it. And if you had infinite viewpoints, because you had like an infinite relational matrix, which is the cosmos, you would see you would see the whole of the thing as it really is.
I'm thinking there like of the sphere of beings in Heidegger, but I think in the sphere of beings, the beings are individual, and it's that realization of there not being a whole. It's like I'm certainly no Heidegger scholar or anything,
but we all
it's that.
remember it. Remember when we were reading Merleau-Ponty and he talks about the horizon? It's the same sort of thing. He's saying, you travel into a thing and then there's a horizon, but the horizon connects all things to one another. It's through the horizon that all these concrete, specific moments of perception are joined together. So it's a similar idea. It's that
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, to that. And just depending on your perspective and your point of view, which is
yeah.
always changing, which is never the same and always different. And
So,
yeah, everyone's point of view is always so different, based on.
and if you're a Stoic, then maybe what they're really saying is something like, next time you have an impression and you know that it's not the full impression because you only occupy one particular point in space and you only have a certain amount of knowledge or whatever, basically you have to ask yourself a pretty simple question, which is, what am I not seeing?
But isn't that terrifying? Because there's always so much you don't see. And there's
Exactly.
always, and then the minutia becomes important.
And what is the Stoic solution to not being able to see a thing? Move. Everything's about motion. So Socrates' character should move closer to the man under the tree. And if he can't get closer for some reason, maybe he could skirt over to the left and try and get a view from the right-hand side. But if he can't do that, then he could see it from the point of view of the cosmic whole, or from somebody else who's standing over there behind the man. And together he can put together the whole perception.
it's still just your impression, though, based on your experience and your position. And yeah.
This is where they kind of bend the rules, right? Because the phenomenologists will say, well, you can only rely on yourself because you can only have one perception. But it seems like the Stoics seem to think that because individual reason is a trace of collective reason, that somehow we can kind of this is a stretch. You guys might think I'm making this shit up, and I could be, but there's a sense in which we can kind of adequately enough by putting ourselves in the shoes of another person, for example, see things that we can't see ourselves.
I think that's the whole goal, isn't it? To see beyond ourselves. And that is wisdom, isn't it? To try.
Yeah. And wouldn't it build a bigger picture of ourselves if I said, I wonder what I look like from someone else's point of view? I wonder what Judith thinks when she speaks to me. I wonder what Catherine thinks. I wonder what my children think. I wonder how my wife feels about me when I come home late at night, and so on and so forth. So I'm able to build up a much more complex picture of my character rather than the one that I walk around with in my head when I base it entirely on my own position in space without thinking about the relationships I share with others.
There's a great sentence that's coming to mind that I think might resonate with you too, Courtney, that a therapist shared with me, an American therapist. It's, I see what you see, what we see.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just love that so much. Like it kind of simplifies it, but yeah, that's what it's about, isn't it?
I think so. And I think because the Stoics think that the whole cosmos somehow transcends all of time and space in some way, that if it opens up possibilities for spiritual exercises, if you like, where you can use it, if you believe like the Stoics, you can access an idea, well, a way of viewing, a position, if you like, a position in space in which you look down on the whole, in which you look down on yourself, in which you see yourself from the perspective of the whole, that life only lasts for a flash and the rest of history is much longer. All those sorts of things. It opens up possibilities that shape character, not because they're I think a lot of people think that there's no reason for it really, but there's the reason. I think the reason is that because you can take any particular position in the relational matrix of the whole to some degree.
I think maybe, well, for me at least, from my experience, is maybe not taking a position too can be very powerful.
Mm. Then you can be a skeptic.
Yeah, definitely. And an Epicurean and a hedonist while I'm at it. And occasionally a Stoic.
Thanks for indulging me, though. I mean, that's sort of just something I've been thinking about, and I think it's present in this text. And I think I'll go back and read this, and I think there's so many little nuggets in here.
Yeah, there certainly are. I mean, this whole passage here is so amazing. So, and I appreciate your reflections there, Courtney, because I think you're right. I think the Stoics kind of took this to into four dimensions. You know, they didn't acknowledge they took it beyond the linear and took it to the entire network of yeah, three or four dimensions. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But this is such a beautiful passage, and Socrates is saying there's not only a scribe that's you're writing our narrative, as it were, in our soul, but he says there's a painter who follows the scribe and provides illustrations to his words in the soul. Now that's amazing. That's Socrates trying to give us a metaphor for our visual memories, essentially, our pictorial memories. You know, he calls it the painter who's inscribing on our soul. It's phenomenal, I think, this passage. And Protarchus is kind of entranced. He says, "How and when do we say he does this work?" Socrates, when a person takes his judgments and assertions directly from sight or any other sense perception, and then views the images he has formed inside himself, corresponding to those judgments and assertions. Or is it not something of this sort that is going on in us? And are not the pictures of the true judgments and assertions true, and of the pictures of the false ones false? So Socrates is kind of describing what our visual or sort of our recollective record is like in terms of both propositions and pictorial framing. And again, because you know these days the study of consciousness is all about what is it that's going on when we remember something. You know, we have neuroscientists whose careers are all about trying to define what it is when we recall an episode, for example, from our childhood. What is that? And Socrates has got this image of the painter who's done a little picture of it. It's amazing.
And this is why I think there's another really interesting difference between Socrates and the Stoics. Socrates here beautifully outlines the problem, right? That you can have this craftsman presenting this whatever, and there's a scribe, and they present these things that get offered to the mind, and that could be wrong. But Socrates doesn't really, after using that metaphor, he doesn't then build a method around the metaphor that you could use then to correct the mistakes. His solution is just weird because of because of all this recollection and soul stuff. But the Stoics, on the other hand, are going to run with it, right? They're going to go, right, okay, here's the problem. You're being presented with this incorrect stuff. Okay, done. How do you fix that? How do you recorrect it? Okay, well, let's invent some, strategies around this. Let's see if we could see that impression again from a different angle. Let's see if we could ask what's missing in it. Let's analyze it and weigh it up and check it out and try and correct it. And I think the Stoics are very practical about how they approach that issue that Socrates so beautifully and clearly illustrates, but really does very little about.
Yeah, he doesn't really solve the problem. And it's just occurred to me that, again, this is another way in which this kind of thing is very much with us. So we have this phenomenon which is tested in the courts now and again to do with memories that are not actually memories, that have been generated generated one way or another, where a person is convinced that something happened in their childhood, for example, and whereas there's no actual evidence to support that, and it's been demonstrated that these memories can be induced in a kind of a lab setting. So yeah, this passage raises all these questions about the reliability of recollection, about memory, about these narratives, and about these pictures. And I think you're right, Courtney, that Socrates kind of just raises it and sketches it, but it's left to later thinkers to kind of pursue it.
And Socrates doesn't point out what the Stoics point out again from a practical point of view. The Stoics will realize that it's not just that you make mistakes routinely because there's something wrong with the scribe. What's going on is people rush, so there's a percept, a thing in the environment, you look at it and you think you know what it is, but rather than check because you're in a rush, you move on straight away. And the problem for the Stoics is going to be that you have assented to an impartial impression, not impartial, an incomplete impression. It could be completely different from what you thought it was. And this applies to things like, maybe my partner gave me a funny look out of the corner of her eye, and because I was in a rush, I took it to be like an insult. So it's not all about three-legged dogs and stuff like that, but you get the idea. And so the Stoics are going to have very immediate practical solutions, like you need to slow down and be deliberate. And that's sort of what Marcus says, right? You should take your time, you should be unhurried. And so these become character traits for the Stoic. It's not that the Stoic is curious and open-minded, which is, what modern people might say. They're thoughtful, deliberate, slow, dependable, untechnical, what do you call it? Like, not frivolous with their language and stuff like that. Very precise and deliberate about their use.
Methodical.
Yes, and also they're not rushed by any impression.
We've got a kind of way to go, and for me, it's nearly 10 p.m. So I'm probably not going to last the distance. Is everyone? I mean, how do you guys feel about kind of doing the second half of it next time? Is that okay with everyone?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
because I think this more relaxed discussion has been very fruitful, and I think I think these are wonderful ideas that are coming out.
And
I think you're right, Courtney.
Really good.
And just to illustrate, to underscore, let's not be hurried about it. Let's take the time and do the rest of the dialogue next time, if that's okay.
And it shows
that
you
would be great.
what a wonderfully rich dialogue it is. It's really good.
I know there's so much here, isn't there?
Yeah, it's great. Well,
and it's fascinating. And it's fascinating that Socrates has come back into the fray after he's written those other late works, which had the visitor or the character in the laws. Is it the visitor? The unnamed.
There's a stranger, I think. The
stranger, yes. And suddenly Socrates is here with us again, so it's great.
Great.
And can I just say before we finish, I loved how you came in, Courtney, later, and there were two Courtneys, because I thought that's really good dialogue, because it's about the one and the many, and that's like, oh, there's two of me, so yeah, I just thought that was very
funny.
Thank you. And because of the many, and because the Stoics are interested in the many and not the singular one, I was able to see you all from different vantage points.
Yeah, and it's like, which one is Courtney? And maybe neither of the two were you.
I was able to form a more coherent picture. All right, guys. Well, lovely to see you, and
till next time.
Yeah.
Till next time. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.